We on? Can everybody hear me? So does it sound like it's on? Okay. All right, good, good. Well, good evening. Everyone doing okay? Good, good. Well, I want to welcome you to our study tonight, and as usual, we will begin with a word of prayer, and then I'll sort of set the table for us, and then we'll dive in. How's that? Okay, let's pray. Our Father, it is so good to be together with people of common faith. We thank you for that privilege and this opportunity. We thank you also for the privilege of being servants of yours, of being partners with you in your kingdom. And we pray that as we look at your word tonight, that you would give us clear insight in terms of what that entails, what that means for us, so that we can be the best we can be for you, recognizing that all we have comes from you as a loan. And so tonight, Father, we pray that we would learn that important lesson from this parable that we're about to look at. And so we want to commit our time to you and ask for your direction and your wisdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. As you recall, we are involved in a study of the parables, and we're highlighting these. We're going to bounce around a little bit, but we're in Luke chapter 12 tonight, and I want to just remind you how we're doing this. Has anyone got a hold of the book that I said I was primarily drawing from yet? I know a couple of you expressed interest in that. I'm just curious to see if anybody had. Okay, that's fine. Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. Um, Kenneth Bailey is the Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. That's the book that I'm primarily drawing from for this series. Kenneth Bailey, the author of that book, lived for 40 years in the Middle East. He was a professor there in seminaries. Believe it or not, there used to be, I don't know if there still are, seminaries in Lebanon and Syria. He lived in those countries. He also lived in Jerusalem for a while, and I believe on the island of Crete. And so he became very familiar with Middle Eastern culture, and he also studied old Christian commentaries written by Middle Easterners, which gives a lot greater insight in terms of the nuances within these parables that Jesus is capitalizing on in his teaching. And one of the things that I emphasized at the beginning of our study is the importance of recognizing that these parables are vehicles, if you will, for teaching us about God, about who Christ is, and it's basically conveying theological truths to us about God and his kingdom and what our responsibilities are. Last time we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan, and we learned some important insights from that with regard to the question that was initially asked of Jesus when the lawyer begins to try to trick him, and he asks, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus sort of turns the whole thing around on him and basically communicates to the guy, you're asking the wrong question. It's rather, who can I be a neighbor to, or how can I become a neighbor to somebody? And he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, which would have been a shocking story in the sense that Jesus had a Samaritan come walking by as the third person. The first two individuals that walked by wouldn't have been too surprising because of the way things worked at that time. But anyway, I liken these parables as like homes where we're invited to come inside and live in there for a little while the story is taking place. so that we can understand and see the perspective and look through the windows in the way that Jesus wants us to look through the windows. Remember, these parables, these stories that he's telling, are stories that were familiar to people who lived back then. Jesus didn't come up with these from scratch, in other words. He's taking stories that people already knew, but he's changing them a little bit to use them to emphasize things that he wants them to get. And a lot of this stuff is pretty radical. Like last time, the Samaritan risking his life to help a Jew, taking this Jew to a Jewish town where he would not be welcome, and then paying for his care and taking care of him when he's risking his life the whole time he's doing this. And this is what Jesus says. This is how you can become a neighbor. And this would have been shocking to the people at the time to hear this kind of a story, or at least the way Jesus told it. And so he wants us to come and live in these stories so that we can understand theological truths about God. And tonight we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. What's interesting about all of these parables is they don't come out of nowhere. They're all preceded by something in the narrative that prompts Jesus to tell the story. Sometimes he's asked a question, and sometimes there's a dialogue that's going on. And so we have to make sure that we remember what that is, what prompted, in the narrative, him to tell that story. That keeps us anchored in the narrative. We can't take these stories out of the narrative and without losing their meaning. There's a reason why they're placed the way they are in the gospel. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Luke chapter 12. All right. One of the things that our culture has been influenced heavily by is Hellenistic culture or Greek culture. We've inherited a good deal of Greek culture. This is what I mean by that is a good deal of the way that we do education. The idea of a university came from the Greeks. How we construct our government, the idea of a republic, came from the Greeks. Remember, Plato wrote a book called The Republic. And so much of the ideas behind our law came from the Greeks and the Romans. Cicero was a Roman, but the Romans sort of plagiarized the Greeks a great deal. Because of that influence has also been strong as well, influencing the way Christians have sometimes thought about concepts in the Bible, that sometimes we lose the Hebraic or the Hebrew way. The biblical people who lived in the biblical world would look at things. And one of those things has to do with the what we might call the dualism of Greek thought. And that actually came into the early church. And some of the epistles that were written by the apostles were written to combat that idea. 1 John is an example of that, the first epistle of John. There were these groups of people called the Gnostics who began to teach that Jesus had not come in the flesh. And that's why John says what he does in that epistle. He says, whoever denies that Jesus has come in the flesh is Antichrist. You see, there's a reason why he's saying that stuff. He's addressing issues, bad theology that was creeping into the church. And because of that dualistic sense, which has come in to influence some of our own thinking, we sometimes want to divide things up in dualisms. An example would be we sometimes divide the spiritual from the physical, right? We do that, don't we? There's a difference between the spiritual and the physical. There's a difference between body and soul. There's a difference. We draw a sharp distinction between body and soul. We draw distinctions between the secular and the sacred, right? Well, in the Hebrew world, those things were not divided up so sharply as they were in the Greek world. And so one of the things we have to bear in mind is that God cares about the physical world, right? If we go back to Genesis 1, what does he say when he finishes the creation? It's very good. At the end of the whole deal, he says it's very good. So God created the physical world, and he said it's a good thing, right? And so one of the things we have to avoid doing is separating, the physical world from the spiritual world and treating them as two different things. God cares more about one than the other. No, that's not how it works. God cares about the world. He cares about the physical world. He cares about our physical bodies. That's another thing we have to bear in mind. There aren't these sharp distinctions in the biblical world that the Greek world tried to draw out. Sometimes we have a tendency to separate one part of our life from another. We separate like what we do at our jobs every day from our spiritual lives. We don't connect them, and a lot of Christians do this. It's a common thing. But what God really wants is for us to not see those divisions as sharply as we sometimes do. In other words, everything we do you should never divorce the spiritual aspect of it. Everything we do needs to have that included in it. Every act that we do should be considered an act of worship to God, no matter how mundane it seems to be, right? So even in the job that you have that you may not like, that's a job that you're supposed to do that in a way that honors God. You don't separate that. So this is what I do for God, this is what I do for myself or for somebody else. No, that kind of separation does not exist in the Scriptures, okay? One of the things we need to recognize is that everything that we have, everything that we get is temporary. It's a loan, right? If we ever forget that idea, if we ever forget that everything's temporary, it's just a loan, been loaned to us by God, then we will begin to look at things wrongly. We'll begin to look at ourselves in a wrong way. And that's probably the most fundamental important lesson that we're going to get from this parable that Jesus teaches, because it's precipitated by a guy who comes to Jesus and asks a question about inheritance. Okay? So in preparation for our discussion, one of the things I want to point out to you, and sometimes these things are missed. This is why I say that every act that we do is a spiritual act, no matter what it is. One of the things that Jesus emphasized and he teaches on more than prayer is money. Did you know that? He has more to say about money than he does prayer. And this parable is an example of that. So let's read the parable together. We'll read the narrative that introduces it, and then we'll go through it in piecemeal fashion and discuss different aspects of it. So, in Luke 12, beginning in verse 13, remember Jesus is teaching, and all his teaching almost all of it takes place in public. So there's lots of people around listening to him. And it says in verse 13, someone in the crowd or someone in the multitude said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or a divider over you?" Then he said to them, Be on Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to myself, self, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And if we were to keep reading, we would see that Jesus continues to expound on this. If you look at the next verse, he says to his disciples, for this reason I say to you, do not worry about your life as to what you will eat, nor for your body as to what you will put on it. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. And he goes through that familiar teaching. But we're going to go back and sort of break this down and see what this story entails, because there's a lot of rich stuff that's being communicated in this story. So really what it's about, it's about a man who failed to recognize that he was accountable to God for everything that he owned. That's what this story is really addressing. It's built upon something that we take for granted today, but people back then could not, and that is, back then there were limited goods, limited stuff, okay? One of the things that we take for granted is that every time we go to the gas station or every time we go to the store, there's going to be food there, there's going to be gas at the pump, right? Once in a while, we get a little taste of what it means to have limited goods. You know, like a couple weeks ago when that storm came, people were freaking out around here, weren't they? I remember seeing people lined up at the gas pumps, and some of the gas stations ran out of gas. And if you walked into the grocery store, you go down the aisle where they keep the bottled water, it was completely empty. People were freaking out, which I thought was a little insane, to be honest with you. But it tells you something. I mean, do you think that these people were probably getting more stuff than they really needed? Yeah. Why would people do that? They're worried. That's why. It's a lack of security. A lack of security. That's something that we all share. We have a lack of security. And sometimes we try to find security in things. And we think that that's going to give us what we need. That's going to fulfill our sense of need, our sense of desire. And we take it for granted. We think that we have an infinite supply of stuff. You know, we just take it for granted. Every time we go to the gas station, we're going to get gas. My brother was telling me when he was traveling in some of the old Soviet bloc countries, he was in Kazakhstan, and he was in Russia as well, that people there just could not count on that at all. You go into a store, and there would be times when the shelves hardly had anything on them. And when some of you know my brother, he's taught a couple times here. As you know, he's married to a Russian girl, Russian lady, and she's brought her mom over a couple times. And what do you think someone like that is going to? What do you think they're going to think when they walk into one of our grocery stores and see that, compared to, the shelves that are often don't have anything there in the former Soviet Union, in Russia. We take it for granted that we will have access to anything that we need. I go on the internet, on eBay, on Amazon, and you can find almost anything that you're looking for. Okay, rebuilding that chainsaw that I got from Gordon, and I've got parts off of eBay. You can get almost anything you need is there. It's readily available. People selling it out of their garages, But in the time that Jesus lived, in the ancient world, that was not necessarily the case. If a person had a good harvest, and a person didn't share that harvest, they were hoarding it for themselves, this would have an impact on everybody. It would have a big impact on everybody. And that's what this story is addressing. It's the idea of limited goods. Now, let's take a look at how this begins. It says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Now just think about how that would come across. This was not necessarily an uncommon thing. People would often come to rabbis who were interpreters of the law and ask them to help sort out a disagreement. How would the law work out this situation? So this wasn't necessarily uncommon. But notice what this guy doesn't say. He doesn't say, "My brother and I are having a little bit of a disagreement here, and about how this inheritance should be divided up. Do you think that you could help us work this out?" He doesn't say that, does he? Look at what he actually says. He says, "Tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." This gives the impression that there's already been a division between these brothers. They've had a quarrel, and there's been a fracturing. And this explains why Jesus responds in the way he does. You can tell he's put off by this. He says, "man." He uses the word "man." Now, I don't know about you, but when you read that, does that sound a little bit funny? Yeah. There's some meaning here by the use of this word "man" to address this person. In fact, in Middle Eastern speech, it's a rough way of addressing a person. It's a rough way. So, Bailey puts it this way. He says, in the Middle East, it would have meant something like this: "I'm not going to use your name, and I'm not going to call you friend. I'm just going to call you man." In other words, you bother me. Okay? Maybe it's a polite way of calling a guy a jerk. I don't know. But it's clearly the case that Jesus is not happy with this guy in the way he has posed the question. He's demanding that Jesus come down on his side, right? Just do this for me. I'm right and he's wrong. I want what I want. And Jesus sees the myopic perspective this guy has. It's selfish, me-ism, me only. Consider my case and mine alone without any consideration for my brother. Do this for me. And it reflects something that I think is very common in our own society today. How people get completely and utterly focused on themselves. It's what I want, and I don't care about anybody else, right? Sometimes our cries for that we hear people whining about on the news sometimes comes across that way, doesn't it? It's very selfish, without any consideration for anybody else's needs and desires. And so Jesus, I think, sees this when he says, "Who appointed me to judge you or to be a divider?" Jesus is not about splitting up people like this. He's about, justice is really about bringing things together in balance. That's what justice means. Okay, it's about settling disputes between people such that everyone is dealt with fairly. Okay, and Jesus is like, "I'm not going to touch this. This is not what I'm about." Because the guy's obviously selfish. And so he says in verse 15, "Beware," and he is very clearly telling us what this is about. "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed." He sees right through this guy. He's a greedy person. And he says, "For not For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. And this ultimately is what it comes down to, isn't it? If we have a wrong view of our possessions, this leads to greed. If you see them as your possessions, it's mine, I deserve it, I should have it, that settles it, What kind of a person is that? That's the kind of person who sees themselves as the arbiter and judge. I'm in charge. I'm the measure of what's right and wrong, and no one else can tell me. That's how it comes across. And that's what Jesus is concerned about. And this is what leads Jesus to this parable. Now, is this something that's unusual that Jesus is going to be addressing? No. Remember, Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to destroy it. Remember, we talked about that last time. And there's plenty of examples in the Old Testament law, in the prophets, about how to handle these kinds of situations. Prophets warned against this kind of thinking. In the book of Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, however you pronounce that, he warns about the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, who are going to come in and take over. And what he says about them in chapter 1, verse 7 is, he says, their justice and self-worth proceeds from themselves. You understand what he's saying? They don't have the recognition that we have, that everything we have ultimately belongs to God. And if you don't have that perspective, then you're going to think that man is the measure of all things, is a way of putting it. In other words, I decide, because belongs to me and my life belongs to me, I decide what's right and wrong. That's the ultimate insult to God, because you're putting yourself in the place of God when you do that. And the prophets warned against this in a number of ways. There's a short paragraph I want to quote to you that I think is very good. It comes from a book written by Leslie Newbigin called The Open Secret. And he puts it this way. He says, if we acknowledge the God of the Bible, we are committed to struggle for justice in society. Justice means giving to each his due. Our problem, as seen in the light of the gospel, is that each of us overestimates what is due him compared with what is due to his neighbor. If I do not acknowledge a justice which judges the justice for which I fight, I am an agent not of justice, but of lawless tyranny. You see what he's getting at? In other words, the only way that I can even begin to think and act justly is when I acknowledge that there's an arbiter of justice and it's not me. Right? And the beginning of understanding how that works is to recognize that I don't own anything. Everything is on loan to me. Okay? You have a different perspective on things when you have that. If you see the stuff you have as your possessions, I own this, it's all mine, you're going to have a different view in terms of how you treat other people and how you look at yourself, you see. And that's the concern that is being raised here. Ultimately, it's an act of greed. Everybody who thinks that they're, we see all these, what they call them, social justice warriors out today. You've seen that kind of stuff on TV. It's interesting. Everyone who is involved in pursuing justice almost always thinks that they're a just person. I'm a just person, and I'm going to see to it that justice is done for this group of people or for that person, and so on. It's very dangerous to approach it that way. It's a kind of self-created justice that comes out of that. And so, again, we must recognize the fact that the only way that we can think and act justly is to recognize, have the right perspective on it, and recognize that I am not the arbiter of justice. Okay? When Jesus says this in verse 15, to look out for guard against every form of greed. Some translations put it, every kind of insatiable desire. I kind of like the way that sounds, insatiable desire. You know, again, possessions are often tied, and the desire for possessions are often tied to a sort of deep fear, an irrational fear that we typically as humans have. It's the fear of one day not having enough. Okay, I meet people like this. Maybe they grew up poor and they had a rough time, and then they've been successful later on. And I mean, I've literally had people tell me this. I do not ever want my kids to have to experience what I did when I was growing up in the poorhouse. And so I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that they have abundance of everything. Very dangerous. It's a very dangerous thing. If that is your outlook on life. Why? Because it will never be enough. You'll never have enough. Because you can always imagine circumstances or a scenario that would indicate that you don't have enough right now, so you got to get more. And then then when you think you finally reached that plateau, oh, I still don't have enough. I can imagine this scenario. Got to get more. It never ends. Why? Because you're trying to feed something that the hunger can never be satisfied. That's why. That's what greed is like. And that's what it can do to a person. It can literally destroy a person, and it isolates a person as well. It can isolate you to the point that you can't see anything except yourself. Even though it sounds like you're doing this for other people, at the end of the day, that's really not what's going on. How do we know this? Because that's exactly what this parable brings out. Look at the parable, verse 16. The land of a rich man was very productive. Notice how Jesus says that. He doesn't say the rich man was very productive. He says the land of the rich man was very productive. Now think about that for a moment. What does the Old Testament say? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. You see. So Jesus is already saying it's not this guy that this stuff came from. You know, the land is what was productive for him. Again, he's supposed to be a steward of this, right? And verse 17, it all comes out. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, that right there is where his problem starts. That's where his problem starts. Now, if you lived in the Middle East and you heard that, you would say, something's wrong with this guy. Because that's not how Middle Easterners reason. They don't reason to themselves. Americans reason to themselves. Westerners do. But Middle Easterners do not. Why? Well, because they're very communal. Okay, remember, all this stuff is happening in public. If there's something that you have to make a decision about, who do you go to? Do you make that decision all on your own? Absolutely not. You make it after the counsel of your family, your community, your friends, and so on. You go to them. And it's a collective decision, in other words. But here's this guy. He's reasoning to himself. And he says, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? Again, the first person singular, emphasizing that this guy is an island unto himself. This is not the typical way that Middle Easterners think and work. Okay? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. Okay? So, again, this independence of thought, independence of action, is all pointing to how greedy this guy is. It's all about him, in other words. And honestly, when you look at this from the perspective of the Middle East, this guy doesn't seem to have any family or friends around, does it? Does he? And there might be a good reason for that. There might be a good reason for that. And then it gets worse. In verse 19, look at what he says. And I will say to myself, or some translations say soul. It's the Greek word suke, which is it's a word that is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word, what is it? Nephesh, I believe, which refers to the self of the individual. This is, the inward self. He says to himself, "Self, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." So, in other words, I've set myself up to the point that I don't have anything to worry about now. I've got it made. I can sit back and relax and enjoy myself. And what's interesting about this is that last part of what he says, what Jesus has him saying here, comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, where he says, "Eat and drink and be merry." Have you heard that before? It's in the book of Ecclesiastes. And what's interesting about that is that Ecclesiastes has a lot more to say than just that. All right? Eat, drink, and be merry by itself, divorced from the context, has one meaning, but eat, drink, and be merry with a different perspective has another meaning. What does it actually say in Ecclesiastes? It says this, and I commend enjoyment. This is in Ecclesiastes 8:15. For man has no good thing under the sun, but to eat and drink and be merry, or enjoy himself. Okay? And we could stop right there and think, well, this guy is fulfilling this. He's got all his goods stored up, right? Just like it says here in Ecclesiastes, where, man has no good thing under the sun but to eat and drink and be merry, right? So he's done that. He's accomplished that. So in his mind, he could be thinking, hey, I've done what Scripture says, right? But if we read on, we see that there's more to it than that, okay? It goes on to say, "For this will go with him in his toil through the days of life which God gives him under the sun." He left that part out of this. What is he leaving out? He's leaving out the part that says the days of his life are a gift from God. You see. In other words, this is all just borrowed, right? It doesn't really belong to you at the end of the day. At the end of the day, God's taking it back. Many other parables address this kind of thing. We're going to see them when we get down the road a little bit. The parable of the talents and the minas and so forth, where these things are given, and then later the master, the king, comes back and he wants them to give an account for what they did with that stuff. It doesn't at the end of the day really belong to them, right? So in the parable, the rich man doesn't reflect that awareness whatsoever. He only cites the first part, eat, drink, and be merry and enjoy himself. He does not remember that the days of life which God are gifts from God that God gives him under the sun. Okay? So this guy is consumed with himself and he's justifying it. And a lot of times people do that sort of thing. They find verses in the Bible that they use to justify their behavior or their actions. And I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but some of these prosperity gospel evangelists on TV, if you can even call them evangelists, telepreachers, do that very thing. And I'm not going to name anybody to protect their guilt, but you know who I'm talking about. You've seen them. And they'll rip verses out of context and act like it's their right to command God to give them what's owed to them. I'm sure you've heard them say this sort of thing, which is astounding to me. I honestly can't help but think that those are the types of people that Jesus is referring to in Matthew chapter 7. Many will come to me on that day and say, Lord, Lord, have we not cast demons out in your name? Have we not healed the sick and the lame in your name? And Jesus will turn to them and say, depart from me, I never knew you. You know, if you really don't understand what the king's business is about, you can't call him king. You can't call him Lord. You know, you have to know what he's about. And that's what these parables are teaching us, hopefully. So Jesus is about recognizing, teaching us about how to recognize who the role that the things that we have in our lives should have, and ultimately what happens to them at the end of the day. And look at what the response is from God in light of this. At the end of verse 19, eat, drink, and be merry. And in verse 20, this is the irony of the whole thing. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is required of you. Okay, let's stop there and address that first. Your life, some translations say soul. It's the word suke again. What is this indicating? What is this communicating? What is it teaching us? This guy has been greedy. He has hoarded all these goods for himself so that he can just take it easy and live a life of luxury and satisfy his insatiable appetites. Possessions that he thinks are his and his alone. And he has failed to recognize that all these things are gifts of God, that God ultimately is the giver of these things, and that they're on loan. But also, what else is on loan to us is our lives. Our lives. We don't own them. Okay? If you did, there would not come a day when you would die. If you did, if you owned your life, then these sorts of things would not happen. But the fact of the matter is, it is appointed unto man to die. Right? God is the giver of life. He's the taker. Remember what Job said when his children were killed, you know, in that terrible calamity that happened. He said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In other words, Job is at least recognizing all the stuff God gave me, and he can take it whenever he wants. That's his business. I don't own anything. I don't possess anything. Whatever God does give me, I'm supposed to be a steward of. It's on loan from him. And one day, he's going to take it back. One day, he's going to take it back. And if I don't recognize that, then I'm going to live for myself in ways that will infect other people and will destroy other people, including myself. Your life is required of you. And then he goes on to say, and now, who will own what you have prepared? Who will own what you have prepared? You put all this effort and accumulated barns full of goods. You're going to die. Where's it going? Where's it going to go? This is the irony of the whole thing. The reality is that we can't hold on to it forever, and someone else is going to get it when we're gone. And a person can build his assets and build his wealth up to such a huge degree and accumulation, and then he's gone, and someone else is going to come in and take it who didn't put any effort into accumulating it, and it's gone. It's over. And that's the irony of this whole thing. It's the point of the lesson here, the point of the lesson is that even when you think you own it, at the end of the day, you lose it. It's all gone. Someone else gets it. You see. Yeah, read it, John. I was going to bring that verse up, but yeah, read it. Let me see if, let's see, 18 and 19. Yeah. Isn't that great? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Jesus is not a killjoy. He's not saying you can't eat, drink, and be merry. He's saying you have to have the right perspective in order to do that. You know, um, uh, C.S. Lewis put it this way, and hopefully this won't offend anybody. But he put it this way: the drunkard can never enjoy a glass of wine for for failure to recognize what it ultimately is, a gift of God. But the person who can recognize that it is a gift of God can enjoy it. You know, at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's about the only way you can truly enjoy life. If you look at life at bare bones, without any consideration of God or anything, it's pretty pathetic, wouldn't you say? You work all your life. You know, there's an old song years ago. I remember. It's a bittersweet symphony. That's life. Remember that? You heard that song, John? Um, uh, how's it go? Maybe my kids can help me. What's the next line? It's a bittersweet symphony. That's life. I can't think of it now. You you're a slave to money and then you die. Something like that. You're a slave to money, then you die. That's a pathetic worldview, if you ask me. But it's a real worldview if you think about it. If you divorce life from its ultimate source, that's what it amounts to. You work your whole life, you know, to pay your bills, to put food on the table, to give yourself some comfort and ease, and at the end of it, you die. And what was it all for? You see. But if you have a worldview that recognizes that there's a God who is the giver of everything and the possessor of everything, and he invites us to be stewards of good things that he has provided, and we have a responsibility to him for what we do with those things, and we have a responsibility to others with how we share those things, and we have a responsibility ultimately to him with our lives, because he even possesses those, because he's going to take it back one day. You know, if you have that worldview, things change. Your life changes. In fact, the way Jesus put it was this: whoever desires to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. It sounds contradictory. It sounds bizarre, but when you think about it in light of what this parable is teaching us, it makes perfect sense. Jesus is not speaking cryptically here at all. He's very clear about what our responsibilities are before God. And he says, so is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So the question we have to ask ourselves, do we want to be materialistically rich, or do we want to be rich in God? That's, at the end of the day, what really matters. So it's about possessions. It's one of the things that is a huge temptation. Jesus said in another passage, you cannot serve both God and money, or God and mammon, is the way he put it. These are contradictory pulls on you, and it's one or the other. Yes, Dan? That's right. That's another good one. I think that's in the Sermon on the Mount as well. Right. Storing up treasures in heaven, don't I would suggest that we not take that in a sort of naive, literal way. What that means is that you recognize that ultimately all your treasure is in God. I think that's what that really means. Sometimes people have this. I know when I was a kid in Sunday school, I would tend to see things in very, wooden, literal ways, and I imagined that there's these treasure chests up in heaven that God's going to open up for me when I get there, that kind of thing. But I don't think that's really the meaning here. The meaning is simply to recognize that God is really the ultimate source of everything that we really desire. And there's some really great quotes here from some important theologians of the past, and I'm just read to you a couple of them because I think they're so good and worth remembering. If I can find them here, let's see. Okay. Ambrose in the 4th century said this: the things that we cannot take away with us are not ours. Compassion alone follows us, is what he said. St. Augustine, who was a student of Ambrose, put it this way regarding this parable. He says, he did not realize that the bellies of the poor were much safer storerooms than his barns. Did you hear that? He didn't realize that the bellies of the poor were much safer storerooms than his barns. Augustine also put it this way. He says, my soul is restless until it rests in you, O Lord. So, the person who fails to recognize God in all of this can never truly enjoy the possessions that he has. I don't think. The possessions that he has will never satisfy him, and he can never really enjoy them. He always have to have more. But the person who recognizes the proper place can, in fact, enjoy them, even if they're meager, even if his possessions are meager, he can better enjoy them than the person who has greed in his heart. So, what we learn from this parable, I think, is profound for us today when we live in a country that is abundant in stuff. And ultimately, we need to recognize that all of our possessions belong to God, and he gives them to us as gifts. And sometimes we have a surplus. And when we have a surplus, what should we do with that surplus? We should share it with those who have need. That's what the early church did in the early chapters of Acts. Remember that? There were those who had need, and this was not coerced by some mandate coming down, like the government saying you have to do this, or the church saying you have to do this. This was done out of love and compassion. It was voluntary. I personally don't believe that any government program can ever truly accomplish what it sets out to do. The reason for that is because it's not based upon virtue. It's based upon coercing people to do things. How can virtue generate out of that? It cannot. It has to come from a genuine compassion in the heart that you have for other people. And I believe that you will be more generous when you have it, when it's flowing that way. Why? Because when you're forced to do it, you're going to be more stingy about doing it. This is why people cheat on their taxes. This is why people don't like paying taxes, is because they don't trust the government to do with that money what they say, and they don't like being told what to do, right? And so recognizing our proper role and recognizing that we are to have compassion for people, and we are to recognize that God has given everything to us in the form of a loan, then we can be the right kinds of givers and the right kinds of people who are seeing justice in the way that God wants it to be seen. All right, that's all I have to say. Any other comments or questions or insights that you might have?